Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Globe Op Talk. I'm Beena Venkatraman. I'm the editorial page editor of the Boston Globe. These Op Talks, in case this is your first one, are opportunities for conversations between members of the Globe editorial board and some of our most exciting and thought-provoking writers who write for the ideas and the opinion pages of the Globe. I'm so thrilled to welcome today Dr. Guy Winch, who is a clinical psychologist, an acclaimed speaker, and an author of several books which have been translated into 27 languages. Guy, thank you so much for being here with us today to talk about the mental health aspects of this pandemic.
It is my pleasure, and thank you so much for having me.
So I want to start with your op-ed. So you wrote this powerful op-ed for the Globe a few weeks ago in which you identified that there is actually a mental health crisis already underway during this pandemic. Can you say more what you mean about that for anyone who might not already be?
Yeah, the interesting thing to me about the pandemic is that while a certain percentage of people will be impacted physically by COVID-19 specifically, we are all being impacted in terms of our mental health and our emotional health, in the sense that we're all living with significant levels of stress, anxiety, uncertainty, loss, trauma in some cases, and it's impacting everyone. And so we are having people who were lonely before now be completely isolated. People who weren't lonely now experiencing loneliness. People who were anxious before can now be significantly more anxious, and people who've never experienced anxiety might start to experience anxiety or are experiencing anxiety, sometimes in significant ways. And those are just a few examples, but the shutdowns, the stress, the uncertainty are just having a big impact, and it's on a global scale. And just myself as a practicing therapist and many others like me are just hearing from so many people about how difficult the situation is for them.
That's understandable, and I see it all around me, hear it around me too. Do you think that this has, in the time since you wrote that op-ed, do you think that there's a growing awareness that this is part of the challenge of what we're dealing with? I mean, we talk about this as a public health crisis, but often I think when people think about public health, they're thinking about the people being hospitalized. They're thinking about the contagion, specifically of this coronavirus contagion. And you interestingly, I mean, I don't know that this is in everyone's lexicon, but you make this distinction between the impact on emotional health and mental health. Can you say more about that, and also whether you think this awareness is actually growing or whether we still have a long way to go?
So first of all, the way I consider mental health is about diagnosable conditions such as clinical depression or an anxiety disorder. And to be able to, to qualify for those conditions, you have to meet certain criteria like you do in any kind of physical situation or condition. So that's the mental health. It's the severe stuff that's diagnosable. But our emotional health includes a lot of situations in which things aren't diagnosable. Loneliness is not a mental disorder, but it's a condition that has significant impact on our lives, both psychologically and physically. People can have significant anxiety, but it doesn't quite cross the threshold of an anxiety disorder per se. That doesn't matter to them. They're experiencing a lot of anxiety, a lot of discomfort, a lot of dread. And so that's a distinction I make between emotional health, which is about the stuff that doesn't rise to the level of an actual mental disorder, and mental health, which covers the things which turn into mental or are mental disorders. And so that's the kind of distinction that I'm making. Can I ask you to refresh me for the second part of that question?
Sure. And well, one thing, maybe just to go off on this tangent for a moment, I think this distinction is really interesting and important, because if you don't have a clinical diagnosis of a mental health problem, you might not notice or recognize that there is a major sort of threat to your emotional health, in your terminology, that's happening right now. So are there particular ways that people who aren't used to sort of having a diagnosis or a mental health situation that they're dealing with on a regular basis to recognize that this is happening?
Yes, first of all, if you're experiencing a lot of feeling of dread, for example, anxiety is a diffuse kind of visceral feeling of dread. It's different from worry. Worry is an intellectual thought, Anxiety is very visceral. We feel the tightness in our stomach or in our chest or in our throat. We feel very, very uneasy. We feel like we might be jumping out of our skin, that we just feel so unsettled. That's anxiety. It's very, very visceral. And it's vague because it's not like fear. Fear is something very specific and imminent happening. Anxiety is about a threat that's not that specific or that imminent. And uncertainty fuels anxiety. People might feel very, very lonely, crave human contact, crave human touch, start to feel like they're being abandoned by their friends, even if they might not be, but start to feel like, wow, people aren't, noticing me enough or reaching out to me enough. And it might be that their friends are, except that they are so starved at that point for that kind of contact that they're just feeling that their needs are not being met, which is a subjective and true feeling on their part. So all these kinds of parents, for example, are feeling incredibly stressed trying to work from home and do the remote learning with their kids and supervise the younger kids. And how do they possibly balance those two things? So stress is something we feel, that feeling is like we just feel overwhelmed. We feel like our thresholds are very low, like the smallest frustration can tip us over and just make us feel like we can't handle anymore because we're like a cup that's just filled to the brim and one more drop will actually spill over. So there are many kinds of ways people might be experiencing these kinds of emotional health disturbances, if you will, or conditions. And the problem is that, and so by the way, to answer your other question, which I just recalled, yes, I think there's more an awareness on an individual level from people feeling like, yeah, things are not okay with me. I'm not okay. I'm struggling. I'm hearing from a lot of people that I'm struggling so much, which in part is normative given what we're going through. But those are the signs that, that something might be going on, is that you just feel out of sorts in all these different kinds of ways and feel like you're struggling and that you're not managing as well as you might.
That's such an interesting conundrum in a way, right? That this is you're saying it's quite normal to feel this sort of struggle, emotional or mental health struggle in this time. And yet, it's also something that one needs to recognize as not being normal circumstances for themselves, right? So each individual person or communities have to recognize that these are abnormal circumstances, but that it's normal to have the emotions or normal to have the reactions. I mean, is that, I guess part of it, I mean, I'll just speak from my own experience. There's disappointment or sort of minor disappointments that I feel in this time, events that get canceled. I was supposed to give a commencement address, for example, and that looks like it'll be postponed if not canceled. And in the scope of things, right, when I know people losing people from COVID-19 or no frontline workers, people who work for grocery stores, people who work in the hospital setting right now, those disappointments seem incommensurate with sort of the suffering all around. So how do I sort of reconcile that it's quite normal to feel some of those negative emotions, but also that we're in this extraordinary circumstance where there's going to be a huge spectrum of how people actually are suffering during this time?
Well, I think we should really not compare our distress to the distress of someone who might have it worse than us, because it's not a correct comparison to make, because we compare our distress to ourselves and to our lives. So there could be someone for whom, who suffered a specific kind of loss. There was a trip that got canceled, and they might be bereft about that trip. They might be truly gutted that they don't get to do that. Somebody else might look at them and say, my goodness, my spouse is working in a COVID ward in a hospital, you're upset about your trip. But to that person, that might have been a trip they've been planning for 15 or 20 years. It was going to be a representation of something that they've achieved or earned, and it was so meaningful for them. So that might be an extraordinarily significant loss. So each person judges for themselves how they experiences the losses, and losses we've all experienced. Fundamentally, we've all lost our way of life in so many fundamental ways. These are not small challenges or changes to our psychology, to our emotional constitution. They're profound. And so we are all experiencing certain forms of loss. You mentioned the commencement address. You can probably mention 20 other things that you've lost in that kind of way. We're all dealing with that. And we should all really just have the self-compassion to understand that we get to be upset about those losses. It's appropriate that we are, and it's fine to feel that upset. And we shouldn't try and say, well, my loss doesn't matter because somebody has it worse. It's just not how we work psychologically.
It's really very fascinating. I want to return to those questions of what we can do as individuals to both notice that we're having these emotions or noticing that we're struggling, and also address some of that, because I know that is a particular expertise of yours, having written about emotional first aid. But I want to ask you for a moment about sort of the institutional response to this. So is there enough consideration being given, even as we respond to the very manifest physical threat of the virus and the pandemic itself, to these mental health questions by governments, by businesses, by communities?
So in terms of governments, I'm not privy to some of the plans governments have, so perhaps they're working on things. I can tell you, for example, one of my specialties is loneliness. There are endless studies about loneliness. It's been called an epidemic before the pandemic started. It's probably a pandemic now. It's truly a significant thing, because chronic loneliness increases our likelihood of an early death by 26%. In other words, loneliness absolutely can kill us. It's a very severe condition to have. Again, not a mental disorder as such, but something we are all experiencing, and we can all experience. Now, if you look at the literature and you're trying to find a broad-based intervention that can be given to a populace at large, at home, over the internet, say, to address loneliness, there aren't studies that are doing that at all. It's not something people have been looking into, despite the fact that it's epidemic. And why people should is because it's one of those things that could be, conceivably, I mean, the studies that we do have imply that with further research, it's possible to come up with some kind of broad-based intervention people can use in their homes. Again, over the internet, with text, with AI, with something that would be helpful. The same is true for anxiety. There are a lot of, when people study anxiety, they have to follow very strict protocols to administer the same kind of treatments so that you can have a apples to apples comparison with people. There are all these kinds of protocols, but they are research based. They haven't really been developed to distribute to the population at large. With tweaks, with testing, with enough time, those things could be developed. And my point is, we're going to need them and other kinds of interventions as well. For example, between spouses, there's going to be a rash of divorces. I'm seeing that already, incredible tension between people. There could be a lot of psychoeducation around relationships and how to manage stress in a relationship. There's so much more we could do. It's just something that's always been low in our awareness compared to the physical. The emotional has always taken, like the back seat to that. And this is a time where we really need to start thinking about, let's put stuff in place that we can really do. We've never done that before, given a psychological intervention to a population. It would be a fascinating thing to do, and this would be the time to do it.
I find that really intriguing. I mean, you must have a hypothesis about why emotional and mental health are not taken as seriously in terms of public programs and that sort of thing.
I do. But just by the way, I'll say that the closest we've come to a broad-based intervention is stay calm and carry on, that kind of thing. It's a refrigerator magnet. It's not an intervention per se. But we have a hierarchy of needs, and the need for physical safety precedes the need for happiness or life satisfaction. And so we have always been more focused on physical safety. It's only really in the last, however many decades that our physical safety has been secure enough that we could point our attention towards the higher need of life satisfaction, emotional security, happiness, etc. And so those things came late in our attention span and our ideas. And with them, the science of psychology compared to medicine is a recent science. It's 120 something years old. It's not, we haven't come far enough. We're still in our infancy in certain ways. Medicine has a long way to go, but it's certainly far more developed than the science of psychology is at the moment. But even then, there are certain, there's a certain idea that, if things are stressful, then, if your job is stressful, then you're not cut out for your job. If things are difficult, then just, man or woman up and just get over it. There's a just stay calm and carry on approach, which really is dismissive of the impact of emotional injuries and of mental health disorders, or all those that don't reach the level of a disorder, and how severely they impact our functioning on a day-to-day pre-pandemic. And people aren't aware how much those are impacts. For example, we have a finite amount of emotional, intellectual resources. Emotional distress leaches a significant amount of that. One of the experiments, I'll wrap this up in just a moment, one of the experiments in loneliness shows that an experiment in which people had a thought exercise of imagining being lonely in 5 years' time, they were not lonely at the time or depressed, caused drops in IQ tests that they took thereafter, because it brought their mood down so much that intellectual functioning took a hit. This is just a thought experiment. We are very much impacted by our emotional health in a day-to-day basis, and it's just something we don't pay enough attention to. And I'm hoping that this pandemic opens the doors to people recognizing, hey, let's start paying more attention, because this is important not just in a pandemic.
That's fascinating to me. And as you mentioned, this idea about the loneliness epidemic that preceded this crisis, I just was so fascinated hearing you describe that there could be some sort of broad-based intervention for loneliness, because as a layperson, non-psychologist, when I think about loneliness, the antidote to loneliness, I think about it as togetherness, just connecting with one's friends, and obviously things that are difficult to do, at least at a physical level right now with our friends and family amid social distancing measures. But when you talk about an internet-based mass intervention for loneliness, what could that look like? What would that look like?
So, okay, well, loneliness does a couple of things to us, psychologically speaking. It causes a certain perceptual distortion in which we are so raw. I mean, loneliness, we experience loneliness as an assault on the body, emotionally, psychologically. It's a stress that suppresses the functioning of our immune system. That's why we are open to morbidity and mortality when our loneliness is chronic. But the distortions it creates make us very risk averse, and it makes us convinced that the people around us actually care less about us than they truly do. And it makes us devalue the idea of the relationships we have. And so we become very hesitant to reach out. The lonely person will go to the party and park themselves by the hummus and the vegetable dip with a scowl on their face and verify that indeed no one came up to talk to them. Well, because they look scary, because they were so upset and it radiated so strongly that indeed they were not the most inviting presence in that party. And so it's not just that people are disconnected, it's that that disconnection has a ripple effect which keeps it going, which makes it a trap that's difficult to emerge from. Loneliness is a stigma. We can tell when somebody is lonely. In social network studies, lonely people get pushed to the periphery of that social network over time because of the stigma associated, and the people around them often get pushed somewhat to the periphery as well, because even being a friend of somebody who's lonely can be stigmatized. Now, loneliness is, just to define it very clearly for people, it is a subjective feeling of emotional or social disconnection. It's subjective, it's not objective. A person can have one friend and feel, or one spouse and feel incredibly connected to them and not feel lonely at all. And someone else can have 20 friends and not feel that connected to any of them and therefore feel very lonely. A significant number of lonely people are actually in marriages and families. They're sitting by their spouse every night. They're just not connected. So it's about the quality, the depth of our connection to one another, and why we can't be physically close at this time. We can be emotionally close. And what I'm finding is that when people are taking the time to reach out to people from their past, they're having conversations on Zoom, or Skype, whatever the platform, they're having conversations which are deep sometimes. They're getting to know people more because there's no way to interrupt, and there's no this, and there's just you looking at another person and talking. So it's possible now to really think about the people to whom we're connected in our lives and try to make those connections deeper by having more meaningful conversation. The last thing I'll say about it is that previously, if a lonely person reached out to someone they hadn't been in touch with for 5 years, and again, because of the stigma, that person would look at them and go like, oh, they must be desperate. Maybe I'll respond, maybe I won't. You have cover now to reach out to anyone, because everyone's reaching out to everyone throughout their lives. People are hearing from people they haven't heard from in 30 years. So right now, someone who's lonely can reach out to people they haven't been in touch with. They can rekindle those kinds of connections, and they can try and make them deeper and more meaningful. And that will help them alleviate at least the social and physical disconnection that we're all experiencing.
Interesting, very practical advice to sort of look for those deeper emotional connections. I will say one thing I've noticed just in my own reaching out to people is that geography is no longer as important as the depth of connection. So I find myself reaching out to people or connecting with people who I might not normally, and there's a kind of knowledge or comfort in our mutual availability, even if we're all working really hard. You know that there's some point in the day where you might be home at the same time, right? There's much less in the social calendar, let's say, to sort of distract people from connecting from each other. So I do want to ask you a bit more about these sort of strategies that people can use at the individual level. But I just want to return for a moment to the magnet, the keep calm and carry on sort of mentality and approach. And because I think a lot of people sort of have that mentality, or they've lived through or have had parents or grandparents who've lived through wars or depressions or any number of other kinds of conflict. And resilience has become a kind of buzzword in the last decade, let's say, for everything from dealing with climate change to overcoming hardship in one's youth. And I think it's resurfacing in the conversations about the pandemic, this idea that we will be more resilient coming out of this. And I just wonder how, because of how you characterize this sort of just kind of deal with it attitude, how does that dovetail with trying to reclaim some sort of narrative or idea that this could actually, some of these struggles could actually lead to more positive results for some people?
So, resilience, unfortunately, is built by going through hardship. There's no other way to do it. You can't do it on spec. You actually have to overcome. You have to go through something and work to get through it and work to recover from it. And I think what's important about resilience is to keep your finger on your emotional pulse to a certain extent, is to truly, ask yourself, how am I doing? I know everyone who wakes up now with a slight tickle in their throat is immediately taking their temperature. Is this it? Do I have it now? Am I getting it now? I would love people to be as involved in their emotional health and see how they're doing in that day where they just cannot get out of bed, or that day where they are so short with anyone else in the house that they just feel like jumping down their throat in a minute. It means that you are being taxed emotionally. It means that something is going on with you. Could be stress, could be anxiety, could be lots of different things. But if you pause and ask yourself, how am I feeling? What's going on with that? Not run away from the negative feeling, but use them as a source of information. Because if you can use the negative emotion as a source of what exactly are you feeling, try and get a little bit more granular in that exploration. That points to what you might need to do about it. If it's loneliness, maybe you do need to make more time to reach out to a friend in that day. And if it's anxiety, maybe you do need to think through what is the thing that's making you anxious, and is there something you can do about that? If it's stress, maybe there's some adjustment you need to make to your schedule or to a certain expectation. It's useful information. So resilience is built not just by going through hardship, but by managing it in a way that's not on autopilot, by trying to take control, by trying to understand and navigate through these very stormy emotional waters, and not just let your ship be, tossed here and there and only to be wrecked on the rocks. Now, when we come through this, my sense is that most people, even the ones that didn't manage it very well, will look back from a place, I hope, of a more peaceful, normative, less stressful time, and look back on this period and go like, wow, that was incredibly hard. I'm stronger than I thought. I think that's a likely thing for people to happen. You just have to try and not break along the way. And so you do need to take your emotional temperature. You do need to try and think when things get to a breaking point of reaching out for help, or at least alerting the people around you, I'm having a really bad day. Excuse me if I'm being irritable. I need some space. Is that okay if I use the room for an hour? Like, try and address what your needs are, because it's going to be important to keep your head above water emotionally. And if you just are on autopilot, you won't realize you're drowning till you're out of air.
That's fascinating. It's almost like you're describing resilience not as a state, but actually as a set of tools or methods that one adopts in order to be resilient. And I think that's really fascinating. So you've talked about, you've already I think sort of jumped ahead in our conversation, which is great, to talk about some of these strategies that people can use. And by the way, we're going to go to audience questions because I hear there are quite a lot of them in a few moments. But so you talked about this emotional temperature taking as a key step, and you've talked about reaching out to others or letting others know about your emotional state, who might be in your presence, who you might be interacting with. What are the other strategies for coping with the particular emotional and mental health stresses we're experiencing right now?
So for people who are not living alone, communication is incredibly important. Maybe you're living in a palatial estate in which everyone has space and room and everything's fine. I doubt that's most people. For most people, you're in cramped quarters. There's not enough bandwidth. There's not enough privacy. There's not enough, you're trying to get this done. The kids are running by. You have your in-laws perhaps there, or you're just bickering with your partner because it's just, been impossible to get away from them and you're not used to being with them 24/7, day after day, week after week, now month after month. So, it's the communication is extraordinarily important. It's important truly at the best of times, but now even more so. And that means have regular check-ins. If you're not used to doing it, do it daily. How are you doing today? What are your needs today? Do you need to use the laptop? Do you need to use the living room? When can I have a few minutes for this? I need to speak to that person. Does that work for you? Are you feeling lonely or disconnected? Let's take some time to go for a walk together and get some fresh air. That communication is incredibly important. Talking to children, explaining about the work at home situation is extraordinarily stressful for people with children because they have to help with remote learning, and they also have to keep them quiet while they're trying to work, and they might be right next to them. And I can't tell you how many sessions I've had with my patients in which a child or a cat, a dog, animals, like there are disruptions all over the place. How do you stay focused? How do you stay concentrated?
I love the pet disruption. Sorry, I have to say.
I prefer those myself because I'm an animal person. So I'm like, oh, that's just wonderful. I get stressed for them because they feel so stressed when the kid bursts into the room or the cat jumps onto the keyboard. But the communication part is about, again, sharing how you're feeling, checking in with the other person. You can make plans for how to divvy up the space, the responsibilities that you have, who's going to do the shopping, who's going to do this, but you need to revisit them very, very frequently because our moods can shift day to day. I might be fine today and I can take this on and I can take that on, but tomorrow I'm having such a bad day. I really would be great if you could do that for me. So if you're not having regular communication, if that kind of discussion is not part of your repertoire as a couple or as a family, you won't be able to communicate that. You'll have to do it in acting out and behavior, which is not the most efficient way to do it. So I just communicate as much as possible with the people in your house, say.
That's great. And for those who are living alone, what would you recommend?
Those who are living alone, the connection part is really, really important. And so I'm speaking with some people, they're like, I spend all day in Zoom meetings. I have Zoom fatigue. The idea of now I'm going to sit and face somebody else, like, then don't sit and face them. You don't need to, like, if they're a friend, go for a walk with, and take them along with you for a walk. Cook together, just decide on a recipe that you're both making, cook together. You can chit chat once in a while in between, but doing an activity together is another way to connect. Watch a movie together. If you do that, try and discuss it afterwards, because that's where connection happens, not just in, all right, movie's over, bye-bye, but what did you think? What did I think? Different sharing thoughts and ideas and themes. So there are different ways you can use video conferencing to connect with different people. And hanging out where you're not just talking, but you are also just, watching the grandkids play. No one has to pay attention to granny or grandpa on the other side. They'll just watch and look up once in a while from their reading, and it'll feel like a visit. But again, you can do those things when you have the idea that, oh, I really need that now. I'm missing, that contact so closely. Just one other thing I want to say about people living alone and loneliness. In all the public health announcements about loneliness, oh, it's like smoking 15 cigarettes a day, it's like obesity. You can't help somebody who's obese. You can't help somebody who's a smoker. You can say once, hey, you should stop smoking, or maybe you should be a little healthier, but that's it, it's up to them. Loneliness can be crowdsourced, and it is now, because now people are reaching out to the neighbor who they know lives alone to see if they need something, to check up on them. Whereas before, it's not my business, and maybe they're a lonely person and I don't want to do that. Now we have the compassion for it. It's considered, a altruistic, kind thing to do. So we're starting to do that more and more and more. But I hope that the idea that what this does is takes away the stigma from loneliness, because if we all just reached out to the people in our lives we were concerned about in that way and truly connected with them, this is a problem we can actually eliminate.
I love that thought, and share your hope that could be a silver lining of this, that we take away some of the stigma of people really struggling with all kinds of different mental and emotional health issues. It's a very hopeful thought. I want to turn to audience questions in a moment. I'm going to invite the Director of Subscriber Experience at the Globe, Chris Avello, to join us. And Chris, maybe as you're queuing up that question, I do want to ask Guy, because Guy, I know you're normally based in New York, but right now you are here with us from Israel. So
That's right.
tell me why you went to Israel.
So I have an identical twin brother. And when things started going south, it occurred to me that, wow, if I get sick, he won't be able to come to me. If he gets sick, I won't be able to go to him. And the minute the shutdown started and all our work, he's coincidentally or not, also a psychologist. And the psychologists in the audience can analyze that later. But I thought, now it's kind of now or never. And I just, from one day to the other, I decided I can't live with the thought of, if something happened to him, I couldn't be there, and I just couldn't tolerate that. So I just packed 2 suitcases, got on a plane, and here I am.
And from what I hear, the weather is far better than it is on the East Coast. So congrats on making the right multiple dimensions. Chris, what do we have from the audience?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Pina. Just want to take a quick, brief moment to say thanks to all the Globe subscribers who are watching and submitted questions. We couldn't do this without you guys, so thank you. And Guy, for you, so many people have engaged with this discussion, are watching, asking questions. So thank you on behalf of our readers for taking the time to speak with all of us. It seems to mean a lot to a lot of people, so thank you.
And thanks to all the readers who are writing and reading and asking questions.
So the first one comes from Christine. She asks, how do we detect the signs that our children might be succumbing to mental health issues, and what should we do about it within the current environment?
So in general, what you want to look for with children is changes in behavior that are uncharacteristic of them. Kids can have a bad day, but if you see a trend, change in behavior that's continuing over time, that should alert you that something might be going on. And again, when I say a change in behavior, relative to the circumstance. In other words, if a child who's hyperactive is really having a hard time being home all the time, that's not a change in behavior. That's an appropriate response of a hyperactive child to not being able to run around as much as they might ordinarily. But a change in mood, a change in what they're saying. They're struggling to do things that they had done before. They used to be a kid who would make their bed in the morning, but now they don't. They used to be a kid who would be smiley and happy in the mornings, but now they're not. They become snappy, or they're retreating. Parents can tell when something is going on with their child, and the first thing you want to do, no matter how old the child is talk to them about it and take them aside and make sure you have privacy. And depending on the age of the child, you can ask open or closed-ended questions, but you should just say, look, I've noticed this change in you, and I want to see how you're doing and what's going on. Now, younger children and even older children might have trouble naming what's happening with them. So I think it's always fair to use multiple choice questions as a parent if you're trying to get to the bottom of something that's going on. Are you missing your friends? Are you worried about mommy or daddy, or maybe granny or grandpa? Are you upset because you miss your teacher? Like, you can go through what you know of your child and what you can ask, try and get a sense of what it is that's going on and try and help them with it. If you find that that's not helping, that the child is still doing poorly, then reach out to a mental health professional. Read stuff online. There's a ton of information online. Myself and almost every mental health professional, many who are not, are putting out a lot of content about how to help parents, how to help individuals. So start there, but track it, and check in. And if things get worse, by all means, look for professional help.
Thank you. This one comes from a different Christine, and actually is a nice logical progression. Do you feel that remote therapy sessions are as effective as in-person sessions? And what can therapists do kind of right now to improve remote treatment?
Look, to be honest with you, I think it's about 90% as effective. And I say that with zero reason for making it 90. I'm just guesstimating. I'm taking a bit off because there's something about physical body language. When I can see the entire body, usually I'm not, when I'm talking to someone, it's like this. I'm seeing them chest high. I can't see if they're fidgeting with their feet, or I can't see, sometimes I can see the certain position somebody's sitting. I'm working with a couple. How are they sitting on the couch? Is there a gap between them? Are they close? This is all useful information, which I might not have on a Zoom call, on a teletherapy session. But other than that, I think it is quite effective because you're just looking at the person, you're seeing them very clearly, you're interacting face to face, and you're talking with them as you would in a regular therapy session. So much of that is preserved, and I would think it's as useful. The interesting thing about teletherapy was that it was very difficult to get reimbursed by insurance companies for it. People actually had to, there were all these complications that were baked into the cake, which were thankfully removed by insurance companies. No, we're going to reimburse. And so now people can avail themselves of it who are in rural areas, in remote areas, who might not have been able to do that before. So I'm hoping more people are experiencing teletherapy in that way, and to the extent that there's a good match between the therapist and the client, which is the key ingredient for success, is that the person who's going to the therapist feels that the therapist gets them. To the extent the match is good, I think a lot more people might be able to avail themselves of those services. So I think it's quite good.
Great, thank you. And I will ask one more from the audience. This one comes from Anne. Do you have any specific recommendations for isolated teenagers who might be feeling particularly isolated given their craving for social interaction?
It is really difficult for first of all, teenage years are tough to begin with. Because they're a time where our focus of the epicenter of our lives is our social circle. It's not our families, it's not our parents, it's our social circle. And here that's been taken away. However, teens today interact significantly over text and over electronic communication. Anyway, teens sit in a group physically together and text each other or text about each other to the same people in that group in real time when there's not a pandemic going on. So those forms of communication still exist. But teens especially like to be with their friends away from their parents. They want to have the freedom and the independence, and that's what's been taken away from teens now, freedom and independence. And so if you have a teen who's struggling with that, give them some privacy, prioritize. If they have a room of their own, allow them to be in it. If they don't, lend them one so that they have some time to be in privacy with their friends, to have a group chat or things like that, which it might be difficult to do with other people all around. Recruit them to, like, if shopping needs to be done, have them go do the shopping. They have some time alone without parental supervision, which again, teens crave being away from that. So try and find ways to give them as much as possible, whatever privacy and independence is possible to bestow, given the circumstance, without endangering anyone's health, of course.
Do you have any notion, I've heard people raising the issue of whether teens are going to actually adhere to social distancing guidelines, particularly as the weather gets better. And I'm not sure what you're seeing in Israel and how it might contrast just culturally and otherwise with what teens in the US would do. But I think there's some concern that asking for complete social distancing from teens might be a little bit like asking them for abstinence when it comes to sex, and that we might be better off giving teens a message that is more about how to be safe when gathering as we go forward, obviously, and are starting to loosen up some of the social distancing measures. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yes, and I don't think it's just teens. I think it would be teens and young adults. Our brain keeps maturing roughly, especially the frontal lobe with all the good decision making and consequences thinking goes until we're like 25, and so it's teens and it's what we call emerging adults that might be more at risk of blowing things off. I think that the best thing you can do there is to be clear with them, because if we're saying it's for your safety, and they're like, well, not really, because not many teens are getting sick, then we're not giving them the right argument. The argument might be, we have vulnerable people in the home. And so you are taking with you the responsibility for the health of your grandparents, literally for their health and their morbidity, for their lives. So take that responsibility super seriously. It's when we just throw a directive out at a teen and not explain it, not discuss it, not ask them like, well, how do you feel about doing that? How do you feel? Like the same talk about like drugs or drinking needs to include things like, okay, I'm so glad that you're on that page. It's very realistic that one of your friends won't be. What are you going to do in that situation where they come over and give you a big hug and try and get close? How are you going to feel saying, oh, please, can you keep a certain distance away? That might be embarrassing to do, or they might look at you like, hey, what's wrong with you? Call you a name. Are you ready for that? Are you prepared? How do you think you might respond? Who's the friend that you think might do that? So get a little deeper, peel a few more layers away so that they're fully prepared, and that you know that they actually have a plan of action for, if it doesn't come from them and it comes from a friend, what they might do.
Such an important set of considerations, especially as we think about moving into the next phase of this. I know we have you just for a couple more minutes, but since you yourself are one of these people, I wonder if you have any advice for the many people out there who are, by virtue of their work or just their nature, are spending a lot of time supporting others through emotional and mental distress right now. What do you do to sort of reinforce your own source of energy and ability to deal with that?
It's a wonderful question. I really kind of feel that in every home, in every group of friends, in every workplace, there are those who are supporting others more, and others are going to talk and to kind of share any kind of form of emotional distress when they have it. What therapists know, because they kind of learn to do this early on, is to kind of keep your finger on your pulse and gauge your tank, how full or empty it is. And when it does go towards empty, to be able to say, you know, I can't talk about that right now because I'm having a bad day myself. Is it okay if I check in with you tomorrow? In other words, keep, notice how much you have to give. And when you don't have a ton to give, take the time to recover, to recharge, because if you don't, you'll burn out really quickly and you won't be used to anyone, yourself including. So you really need to, if you're that kind of person who's being supportive to a lot of people, it behooves you to really pay attention to how you're doing. And that doesn't mean, oh, like, for example, therapists know I can do this many sessions a day, but really what kind? Because some sessions are much more taxing. Some sessions, some issues, a friend might come to you with something that really plays on your own issues and emotions, and that'll take way more out of you than something that doesn't. So you really just have to pay attention to how you're doing, and if you're in doubt about whether you can talk to another person that day or that week, then don't. It's more important that you use the time to recharge, to recover, to kind of de-stress, and then you'll be much more useful to the people around you.
Really important advice and incredible insights. Thank you so much, Dr. Guy Winch, for being part of this Globe Op Talk. And thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. If you had feedback for us, we're in the early stage of these Op Talks, please be in touch by email or at Globe Opinion on Twitter. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.